Facebook Live.
Okay.
I see where it says live, but I don't see it yet, Kathy.
You want me to, I can check my phone and see if it's up.
Please, because
Yeah.
I'm checking mine right now and I don't see it.
Right, because it could be that because you two are directly linked. Might not be able to see it, so let me look.
I see it up.
On Kathy Greggs?
You are definitely live, you guys.
All right, good. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Will.
Thank you.
Hello,
Yes.
everyone. Good afternoon. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us for Fayetteville Pact's first annual Injustice Week event. My name is Manny Diaz. I am a board member at large with Fayetteville Pact. I deal a lot with immigration issues in the southeastern part of the state. And of course, I engage with partners across the state. I am here being joined by my amazing co-host, Monique Edwards. Monique, if you want to introduce yourself really quick.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Monique Edwards. I'm a board member with Fayetteville Pact. I do serve as the secretary, but we also work to use a lot of my other skills working with writing policy, editing policy, analyzing policy, because the goal is to make sure that North Carolina does present more aggressive and progressive legislation in the General Assembly.
Thank you, Monique, so much. We are being joined by several panelists. We'll get to them shortly. Let me briefly explain some context as to the purpose of this particular event. We are here to talk about the North Carolina Task Force for Racial Equity in Criminal Justice. This was a very big discussion topic throughout 2020 with everything that was going on. And me personally, I've been feeling like it's been going to the sideline a little bit. We kind of tend to forget what happens as soon as more things go on in society. But I think this is one of those things that we can't just drop and forget about. We have to continue the conversation because that particular task force deals with the suffering that we see, across the state and across this nation. So it's something real that we have to continue to engage. And for those of you that don't know, the task force was established by Governor Roy Cooper in June 2020. Attorney General Josh Stein, and NC Supreme Court Justice Anita Earls. The task force itself consists of 24 members ranging from a variety of fields, the nonprofit world, law enforcement, of course, justices, so on and so forth. I do want to say right now that the task force, it's not absolutely perfect. It's not being implemented the way that it should, but we're hoping that through pressure, through continued organizing, through outreach, we can get those actual changes that will see true justice in our society. A lot of people are suffering because of those inequities, and I'm hoping that as time goes on, we can actually fix this issue. Monique, do you want to add anything extra in terms of context about the task force?
Yeah, so one of the things that we noticed when looking at the task force is that, for this to be a task force that's about racial equity, the task force in itself doesn't reflect a lot of racial diversity. That language is being used a lot in those recommendations, but the task force itself, it's not very diverse. I think we're definitely gonna be talking about issues that the task force is not addressing at all. And we believe that the reason that those things are not being addressed is because there is no representation there to discuss it. Law enforcement has touched every single race throughout the state of North Carolina, especially Latinos, especially people who are LGBTQ, those who are Native, even though I think there's a few Natives on the task force, but people who are Indian, people who are Asian Pacific Islanders, but even though law enforcement touches all of that, the task force doesn't have any of those bodies, right? There's no one to represent or speak for the needs of those who are Latino, those who are AAPIs, it's LGBTQs. I mean, it's just absolutely astounding that something would be called racial equity, and then in itself, the task force doesn't reflect that. So that's the most glaring thing for me that I want to share right now about the task force. It's not racially diverse. And this is why we had to have this Zoom meeting, is because there's a lot of things that they are not getting into that really need to be addressed through this task force.
Thank you, Monique. But before we actually keep on going with the event and talk to you about what task force is, what's included in it, what the recommendations were, and what's missing, let's take a brief break right now to introduce our panelists.
Yeah.
I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, so to speak. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourself. Felicia, we can actually start with you.
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Felicia Arriaga, or Dr. Arriaga, depending on how you want to address me. And I've had the pleasure of working with so many folks on this call before. I'm the North Carolina Statewide Police Accountability Network Coordinator, which is a project of our Black Leadership and Organizing Collective, or NC Block. And I also do a lot of research on the criminal justice system, and specifically looking at administrative policies that we'll get into today. And I can pass it over to Noelle, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you tonight. I am coming to you from Asheville, but I am the director of the North Carolina Coalition for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, which is a statewide grassroots organization committed to abolishing the death penalty in North Carolina. We have 15 coalition partners, of which Fayetteville Pact is one, and lots of other organizations as well. Some are involved in direct litigation around death penalty cases, and some, more like Fayetteville Pact and Emancipate NC, are involved in broader criminal legal reform. My background is in social work. I've worked for 15 years on death penalty cases. I am really committed to restorative and transformative justice and looking at the systemic racism of our system that drives everything about mass incarceration. Thanks for having me with you tonight. And I'll pass to Sarah.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah Smith. I'm a statewide community organizer with North Carolinians Against Gun Violence. We work on preventing all types of gun violence through education and advocacy. I'm going to speak a little bit about data around gun violence in North Carolina, and specifically about police-associated deaths in North Carolina, and what the data tell us and what is left out of the data that have been reported.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone, for those introductions. So let's get to it. Let's talk about the task force itself. And I think, this task force didn't come out of nowhere. There's some political and social context in regards to the task force. And I think that the best person that could speak about it, and I hate to put you in the spot over here, but Dr. Arriaga, could you talk to us about the context of the creation of the task force?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not on the spot, but and I actually wanted to point out, so I also had the pleasure in some ways of being on another committee that was happening at the same time, which I think it's talked about less, what was more of a bipartisan effort. So meaning that Republicans and Democrats were trying to sit together and talk about these issues. So I think in the reports on this, the House Select Committee on Community Relations, Law Enforcement, and Justice was actually started before this task force. And that was put together by the Speaker of the House, right? And so that particular sort of body was meeting at the same time that sort of the task force started to meet too. So there's a little bit of context there, because I think the issue of criminal justice, especially for us on this call, right, it was not new for us, right? But as far as thinking about the uprisings that were happening across the country, we saw a lot of this in the spring into the summer of 2020, right? So with the murder of George Floyd, people are really starting to pay attention again, right? Unfortunately, this happens often when we see murders, especially of Black men and women across the country, where people start to sort of pay attention again, right? Even though, again, all of our sort of areas, this is something we pay attention to all the time, unfortunately. We're often sort of with family members talking with them about sort of the ongoing impact of the carceral state or the criminal justice system. And so I think this at least was part of that push, right? To sort of, we want something to be done in this moment, right? And so unfortunately, I think like in so many instances, we see that task force sort of things or commissions are put together to try to at least tackle some of the issue. And I think for us on this call, we're all expecting, or at least like wanting more action, right? Like we know what the issues are. People in our communities continue to tell us what the issues are time and time again. And so whether it's the House committee that put together less recommendations, I think we only ended up with about 20, or this sort of task force that is continuing to meet, right? All of us know that some of these issues are not being taken up, right? So COVID-19, right, which is still ongoing. I don't think any of the recommendations mention anything related to COVID-19, right? Some of these things that I think for us on this call, there's some pressing pieces that we wanted to sort of like continue to raise awareness of. And so I think that there's obviously a longer history of particularly law enforcement, which I think many of us think about, and sort of like what does reform look like for that group. But we also know that sort of the carceral state, sort of the criminalization of Black and brown bodies, like that's been unfortunately a long history, right, of what's happening. And I think earlier we were talking about what that legacy means, right? That whenever we're talking about sort of even something like training, right, that needs to reflect how we've gotten to this point, right? How we've got to a system where what we now know of sheriffs or police used to be slave catchers, right? Used to be the people forcibly removing indigenous folks from their lands across the West when sort of the founding of the country started, right? So one sort of aspect, one sort of point in this historical trajectory of how we see the carceral state developing as we go along. So I think that that's a long, short history of what's been happening, but these particular commissions all, I think, came right after sort of the uprisings, where we saw so many people taking to the streets to make sure that people understood that this isn't just George Floyd, this is folks in our communities who are also suffering from the carceral state.
Thank you, Dr. Arriaga, for stating that this problem isn't new, right? It's been going on for decades and even hundreds of years. It's deeply rooted in something here in the United States that we'll actually talk about very shortly. But it's clearly that the murder of George Floyd exacerbated the issue of police accountability, right? More need for transparency, more need for actual, if something happens, there's something that is actually done to fix the problem, that want and that need for a push. But you mentioned recommendations a lot, Dr. Arriaga. Can you explain to the audience, what are we talking about whenever we say recommendations? What is the task force doing? What are they meeting about?
Yeah, and I think other folks probably have been paying attention too to this. I mean, they've been reading about a lot of sort of different areas of this bigger sort of criminal justice system, right? Or the carceral state is a different way to call that. And so I think that they have some overall recommendations, but they also have specific things that they're at least saying to, say, judges, other sheriffs, police offices, that these are things that we would like to see you change, right? I think, unfortunately, for some of us, we recognize that making those recommendations doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do it, right? And also that potentially they don't have the power to actually do anything differently. So that's sort of why the recommendations, it's great, especially if there was better processes to get that feedback of what people want to see in the recommendations. But I think that that's even something we'll get into today too, is that we don't have a lot of opportunities to actually have our voices heard in these recommendations, either at the state level or at the local level. So I think these are all sort of things that could be done differently. But I think we all know that sort of shifting these things and making them actually into implementing them is a different part of the battle, right? So we can talk about the things, but where does the implementation, where does the action come in? I think that's the question we all have in this at least space.
Thank you, Dr. Arriaga. And of course, for the audience, once again, they released their recommendations, or the task force came together right after huge outcry and need for accountability. And they released 124 recommendations about what law enforcement departments could do to make sure that they're transparent and that they actually hold bad actors accountable. Those particular recommendations are broken down into different topics, and they're all publicly available. But I don't want people to get a misunderstanding that this is simply a continuation of those protests that happened from George Floyd. This is something that's trying to tackle something much deeper than that. And we have, again, two other panelists that can speak about those things, those real life issues that require or emphasize the need for the implementation of these recommendations. I'm going just to pick someone randomly to begin, and I guess I can go with you, Sarah. Could you introduce yourself once again and just kind of explain the issue that you see in North Carolina that would require these recommendations to actually be implemented?
Sure. Thank you. My name's Sarah, and I'm with North Carolinians Against Gun Violence. I also have a public health background, and so I work some on data relating to gun violence in the state, presenting that data. So I have some slides that I can share if that's okay, Manny?
Absolutely. Are you able to share?
Okay. Let me go to slideshow. Yes, I think that I'm able to, so I will just put it up here. And I will start the slideshow. Oops, sorry. Okay. So in North Carolina, in terms of firearms deaths in 2018, and these data come from a report that we put out in 2020 that up to that point only had 2018 data available. So that year, there were 1,416 deaths of gun deaths per that year. This was about 3.9 lives lost every day, or around 4 lives lost every day. By number of firearms deaths overall in the country, we rank 7th. By rate of firearms deaths, and the way we count rate is number of deaths per 100,000 people, we rank 24th, so somewhere in the middle of states. Okay, so which counties are suffering the most gun violence in the state? And these are 2016 to 2018 cumulative total. So this is the total over those 3 years. The Cumberland County had the 4th highest number of firearms deaths at 183. And again, that's over a 3-year total, not per year. The Cumberland County ranked 3rd for the number of firearm suicides, and 4th for the number of firearm homicides. So this 183 number over here, the suicide and firearm homicide do not add to 183, they add to 180. So it's possible that deaths like CDC's category of legal intervention deaths may be included in that category. So our preliminary data for 2020 was a year like no other year for every issue that we can talk about here. And that was certainly true for gun violence. So because CDC and North Carolina DHHS won't have their data available until 2022, and that's because it takes a while to review the data, clean it, compile it, and then publish it. A lot of media sources use gun violence archive data, which is much more current, but only relies on publicly available data sources. So it too is imperfect. But it does give you a general idea of trends happening in the US. So 2020 in North Carolina and in the US was the largest 1-year increase since record keeping began in the 1930s. And 2020 became, according to GVA data, became the most violent year of the 21st century. And that looks to be true for North Carolina. And that's a quote from an article where Dr. Philip Cook, a criminologist, is quoted about gun violence last year. So Gun Violence Archive includes a category that they call officer involved incident in their database. For 2020, the gun deaths gun deaths among officers was 60, and this is for the whole US, and gun deaths in the subject suspect category, so people who were killed by police, was 1,293. And again, I'm using GVA's terminology on this, but you can see a huge discrepancy. CDC uses a slightly different definition. They use the term legal intervention deaths. And so I included the definition here: injuries inflicted by police or other law enforcement agents, including military on duty, in the course of arresting or trying to arrest lawbreakers, suppressing disturbances, maintaining order, and other legal actions. But it excludes injuries caused by civil insurrections. So what we don't know about data sources that include aggregate data, so just the overall numbers of categories like gun deaths or legal intervention gun deaths, is that we don't know anything about the individual circumstances in each case, because those are left out. They're just reporting numbers that fit into categories. So I have a little bit of data here from CDC and the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, the Injury Prevention Branch. So this graph here looks at the firearm rate between North Carolina and the US in what CDC again calls these legal intervention deaths. And you can see that in general, the US and North Carolina are tracking to be pretty similar in terms of the number of deaths per 100,000 people, whether that's North Carolina or the US. There are a few outliers here in 2016 and then again in 2019, but in general, they're pretty similar. This bottom table here is data from the North Carolina Injury Prevention Branch or Department of Health and Human Services. So these are state data, and they start in 2015 based on what I was able to find. And you can see the numbers are not exactly the same. So some of that may be the methodology for counting. Some of that may be because the Injury Prevention Branch is really careful to go back and check any categories that initially were unclear. So something may be marked as a homicide initially because it may have been coded that way by a doctor. They may go back and find that it was recategorized as these police involved deaths or legal intervention deaths. So that could be another reason that the numbers are different, but you can see they're definitely different during this set of years. And only through 2018 were available through the state at this point, again, because it takes them longer to compile data. So they haven't, their 2019 data are not available yet. So if we look at the racial background, the racial breakdown of legal intervention death, and this is CDC data, and because the data are not available 1 year at a time by race, because the numbers are so small, I looked at the overall totals here. So the number of these legal intervention deaths are higher among white North Carolinians than Black North Carolinians. However, the rate is much higher. If you look at the rate, and again, per 100,000 people, the rate is higher among Black North Carolinians than among white North Carolinians. And that also, if you look here at the US rate, it's pretty similar to the trend in the US as well. So the numbers that we get aren't necessarily telling the whole story. And I just to get an idea of what's happening this year in Gun Violence Archive, I exported data from their database, and to give you a range of the places where these deaths are taking place. I noticed when I exported the data, if you look here, the Boone mass shooting is here on this April 28th. Which confused me at first. And then I remembered that an officer died in that incident and there was a confrontation with an officer. So the way that we think about criminal justice and the way that we think about police deaths is not necessarily reflected in the way that some of these deaths are calculated. And that's, 5 out of 28 deaths so when we look at these data, we have to be careful in how we're interpreting them. And the Gun Violence Archive data is in some senses really useful because it does give us data about each individual incident, but because they use publicly available data sources and it's, they're tracking it by day, it's possible that they're also missing cases that when we are talking about these issues might otherwise be included in these data. Their data searches may not have caught. They're also using a broader definition than some other data sources. And again, when you use a broader definition, it makes the very specific data that we're looking for a little bit harder to become clear when we look at the overall numbers. And thank you. That's the end of my my talk.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for providing. I'm sorry. I think Monique, did you want to say something?
I am okay. No, I accidentally hit the button. I was taking notes because this was really good information.
We'll actually go back to that one, Sarah. You mentioned a lot of things that are pretty interesting, right? The discrepancies, racial discrepancies there, even though the number may be higher, we could account that to population differences. I think the rate kind of speaks for itself. And then other things in regards to officer-related deaths with individuals. I mean, it's a lot of stuff to digest. But if people want to hear and just read more in depth than what we have actually in the conversation, where can they go to get that information, Sarah?
So some of the data are available in our 2020 report. So ncgv.org has through 2018 data from CDC and DHHS. Some of the more recent data I pulled for this presentation, but I'd be happy to answer any specific questions or offline walk people through the methodology that I use to find those data and use GVA website and that kind of thing. I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Noelle. I'm sorry.
Oh, and I'm Sarah at ncgv.org if anyone in the audience has specific questions on the data.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. And with that being said, like I said, we're going to go back to that information later on. We'll kick it off to Miss Noelle. If you don't mind introducing yourself one more time and then just share your information.
Sure, thanks, Manny. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Noelle Nickel. I'm the director at the North Carolina Coalition for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And what was really resonating with me during your presentation, Sarah, was just this deep desire that I know we all have for everyone to be safe.
Right.
And so what I just want to be real clear about, what we already know, over policing our communities does not make us safe. Excessive sentencing, mass incarceration does not keep us safe. And likewise, the death penalty does not keep us safe. It is not a deterrent to crime. It is not a deterrent to homicide. It is excessively expensive, and it is excessively racist. And so I think it's really important, and that's why I really appreciate tonight's opportunity for us to just continue to find these threads between all that we're talking about. And so we know that mass incarceration is an extension of Jim Crow. And we know that the application of the death penalty today is an extension of racial terror, of lynching. And the data supports that, and I can provide more of that in another conversation. But when we look at who is sentenced to death in North Carolina, the overrepresentation of people of color on our death row, when we look at the absence of people of color on our juries, we know that systemic racism is at the root of the death penalty system. It's really interesting, to mention in the context of the TREC recommendations, kind of this feeling, I think, of, oh, well, what can we do now? And in fact, when we look at the recommendations that are specific to felony sentencing, the death penalty, some of these really systemic issues in terms of racism, but they appear to be out of our hands, because frankly, it's going to take legislative action to change a lot of what needs to happen. But what I want us to be aware of is that our DAs also have a whole lot of power. And I just want to shine a light on Cumberland County, your DA, okay? You have 6 people on death row right now. You have a notorious history, I want to say, with the Racial Justice Act. And in fact, one of the recommendations is to reinstate the Racial Justice Act in North Carolina. While that will not get us to abolition, it would be a really fine start. So the Racial Justice Act was passed in 2009. It allowed attorneys to use broader statistical evidence of racial bias in the application of the death penalty. And as predictable for the majority at the time in our state legislature, it was repealed in 2013. However, nearly every person sentenced to death in North Carolina, and that's 135 individuals, has standing claims using the Racial Justice Act. And in fact, we will have a RJA case heard in 2022. And in fact, you have had 4 individuals in Cumberland County resentenced from death to life using the RJA litigation. So just a little more data about how we see racism played out in the application of the death penalty. So our state is approximately 65% white. And yet, if you look at the 135 people on death row, 53 people are white. If you look at the juries that sentenced those people to death, more than half of those juries were all white or had only one person of color. If you look at the people who have been exonerated from death row in North Carolina, we've had 12 exonerations. So those are people who were wrongfully convicted and were completely innocent. And we've had 12 exonerations in North Carolina. 10 of those were Black people and 1 person was Latinx. So it's just so obvious, right? And yet we continue to pursue the death penalty. In fact, we have 5 trials scheduled in the remainder of this year. So I really am grateful for us looking at all these issues because they are so interrelated. We know as long as we have the death penalty as the penultimate harshest crime, that the racism of that system trickles down throughout our whole criminal legal system. People are more inclined to false confessions if they're threatened by death. The retributive, vengeful aspect of the death penalty, slants everything else in our whole system. So while at the coalition, we're really committed to broad criminal legal reform, we just really want to keep reiterating that as long as we have the death penalty, it's going to be inherently racist and inherently unjust. There are a couple of other recommendations, and then I'll stop. There is one recommendation to raise the age. It's currently 18, to raise it to 21. at the age of the person when they committed the alleged homicide. And so that again would chip away at the system, not abolish it, but chip away. And similarly, a bill to exempt people with severe mental illness, and that would also chip away at the system. And the last recommendation that I see that is kind of most directly related goes back to this broader conversation that we really have to have as a state, and that is an establishment of a truth and reconciliation process where we could really get at the heart of repair. That would, I think, be amazing. Of course, it would have to be led by the people who have been most harmed, right? That's where we have to start, in hearing from people who have been most harmed by the system. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ms. Noel. That was fantastic information that you shared, and you clearly stated the discrepancies, the racial discrepancies that we're seeing in regards to the death penalty here in North Carolina. And thank you so much for emphasizing or just pointing out some of the recommendations. Again, we have 124 recommendations in this task force, right? And they're broken out into different sections. And I believe the ones you were mentioning were eliminating racial disparities in the courts. You don't have to read the entire giant report, audience. There is a list, a nice list you can find online of all the 124 recommendations, what topic they're discussing and what they're trying to do, and who is actually, or who has to take action, political action in the community to actually implement those things. So with what Sarah and Noel stated, it is clearly evident that change in North Carolina is needed. And while the task force and these recommendations may not be perfect, it is clearly a good initial step. And that's just my feeling over here. Monique, based on what you heard, I just wanted to hear your thoughts, because to see you over there taking notes, to see you over there shaking your head, let me hear what you have to say.
So, so I grow frustrated every time I see any task force or any new committee, because I feel like, when someone is defined as qualified to be on these task force or these committees, they're deemed as experts. And I feel like the task force is taking on things in more of a surface manner. They're not really getting to the meat and the potatoes of it all. And, it just drives me crazy, I guess, because I'm always looking at policy, and I'm always looking at regulations and policy, internally, even with law enforcement, right? Because, it's not that the task force doesn't understand, right? But I feel like some of the individuals on the task force are in the way of real justice simply because of the status that they hold. So when we talk about, when I think about the death penalty, when I think about mass incarceration, right? The thing that really kind of burns me is that in this task force list, qualified immunity is not addressed, right? And it needs to be addressed. Immigration is not addressed at all. And it makes me wonder, when we think about, the fact that we have sheriff departments across this state that are not cooperating with ICE, and then you got sheriff departments that are cooperating with ICE, there is clearly a divide here. But yet the immigration matter did not make, the list. And I know we chuck it up to, the whole thing not being perfect, but I feel like there's some glaring, obvious, very finite, very succinct things that we know need to be tackled. And I believe that they know as well, but they're intentionally not putting it up there. Qualified immunity is not being addressed because when you look at qualified immunity, you are asking law enforcement to hold itself fully accountable when the people who are on the task force are incapable of holding themselves fully accountable, right? I will say that even when you talk to some police departments that say we do need to deal with this, but the main reason we don't want to deal with it is because the focus is succinct on removing qualified immunity from officers. And the officers say, we shouldn't be the only ones that have the qualified immunity removed from us. We want to include judges. We want to include, officers of the court. So that's why qualified immunity didn't make it on the list, because the officers are going to put up a fight if it's just going to be them. They don't want it to just be them. The judges, right? They don't want it to be them.
Sorry, I'm going to cut you off there, but
Yeah, no problem.
For everybody else, can you explain what qualified immunity is?
Oh, it means that if you're working in the capacity of your job in law enforcement, or it means that if something happens on the job, they qualify you in the courts through representation from the Attorney General's office, that you are immune from prosecution. So you get immunity. So you won't be prosecuted if something happens when you were operating in your capacity of work.
Thank you, Monique.
Yeah, so it just becomes super challenging. And it's really just such a struggle when we already know that there is not one industry that is given a immunity, so to speak, in the event somebody is harmed. There's not one industry that's allowed this, but yet law enforcement, elected officials, those who work in the courts, they are given immunity, and it's not right. It's not right, because because mass incarceration is the result of that qualified immunity. Misidentification and putting the cuffs on people being labeled as needing the death penalty versus life. All of those things play a major role in qualified immunity, and Lord knows the cover-ups. I mean, we'll get into that later, but at another point. But it makes a huge difference, and it really is the difference between life and liberty. It really is. So, Manny, I'll let you go take over from after this, but I just wanted to say that, because I'm telling you, seeing those criminal statistics from Sarah's report, there's a reason that we get to that, and it's not simply because somebody committed a crime. It just isn't. Because when I think about that task force, the one thing I didn't see on that task force were people who were wrongfully convicted. Did anybody see anybody on that task force that had been wrongfully convicted? No, there wasn't anyone. And they would know better than anyone what the real problems are, because they had been wrongfully convicted and then exonerated. That's who they need to have on that task force.
That's a fantastic point, Monique. And you kind of jumped ahead over here, because
we
need to talk about what's missing from this task force, right? I mean, credit where credit is due, but it's not perfect, like we've mentioned multiple times. And I want to leave this question open before I talk about the perspective of what bothered me that's actually missing from there. Any of the panelists want to discuss anything that's missing from the task force in general?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I feel like so many of the discussions, especially in 2020 around the country, were actually about sort of budget allocations and how much money law enforcement was getting. I don't think that there's anything in here that something simple like we have to review how much money you get, right? Any sort of components of the carceral state, which I think for me, that's how I started sort of in this space. Like I started doing immigrant rights work, but I also helped in the Durham Beyond Policing campaign in Durham. And for us, that was central to all of this, right? Is thinking about sort of where do we move money and invest it in other sort of aspects of a community, right? So I think for me, the budget, any type of like that kind of oversight is missing, as well as, and I keep on thinking about like how much power does these like associations have, right? So some of and Noelle, you posted this today on sort of the Facebook group, and I read through it and I was just like, this is so great, because it actually lays out the power or the power that actually police unions in North Carolina don't really have, right? They don't have collective bargaining power, which is typically what we think about as unions, but they do have a lot of influence, right? And so for me, I just keep on thinking about the Sheriff's Association. Manny and I get to work together, and Kathy, and we get to work together when we talk about the Sheriff's Association and members of them going to the state legislature and saying, hey, we want more ICE policies, right? And so for me, I'm always just thinking about, how are these associations, how do we actually start to minimize their influence on these things, right? The same for the DA's association. And it's not just when they decide to stand up and do something, it's actually when they decide not to stand up and do something,
Right.
too, right? When they could easily, right, easily sort of step in and say, hey, actually, we don't want some of these policies in place, but they don't typically do that, right? And so for me, I'm just trying to look for, how do we really start to chip away at some of the influence of those types of organizations, even if they don't actually represent unions in the way that we typically think about unions, right? They're collective bodies that are able to influence state legislation. And I think for us, that's one that we really should be actually thinking a lot more about in this moment. And so that's for me, like those two big pieces on top of the ones that people have already said. I think for me, those are ones that have been on my mind lately.
Yeah, if I could just underscore the power of the Conference of DAs in our state, you know, there was some legislation that was really favorable that they opposed this past session. And so unless we can get some changes in our elected district attorneys and their leadership, it's going to continue to be much harder. And also civil service boards in terms of law enforcement, that is a huge problem. In terms of, like you mentioned, Monique, qualified immunity and civil service boards stepping in when someone really should not be in law enforcement at all.
Right. I know I'd love to add to what Sarah was saying, as well as you, Dr. Felicia, concerning the prosecutors, right? So when a DA runs for office, they tend to run on these records around, I've locked up so many people, you know, it's like a badge of honor, which goes against the path for racial justice and equity, because you are tooting the horn and saying, I'm proud that I locked up these individuals, right? But I've never seen a campaign that talks about how proud they are that they locked up 82% African Americans. See, they don't get into, you know, the details of it. They say, you know, I've won 94% of all my cases. And it's like, we've got to start restructuring how prosecutors get to define their worth, and it can't be through putting people in prison, you know, in jail and into prisons.
Thank you everyone for adding your thoughts to it. And I gotta say that one of the biggest things that's missing from the task force is something that's really bothered me, is that immigration aspect, Monique, that you mentioned, right? Again, the task force at the end of the day is recommendations for change in the relationship between police officers and the general public, right? Especially the Black and brown community in North Carolina. But I don't see anything that deals with the relationship between police officers and the immigrant community, apart from what's coming from the General Assembly, that makes that relationship even more difficult and more, you know, creates more tension. We have legislation in North Carolina, like Senate Bill 101, that directly, you know, it's exactly what we're talking about, that relationship between the police and the immigrant community. But there's nothing in these recommendations that talks about the protection of people's rights, because people, whether documented, quote unquote, or undocumented, quote unquote, they still have rights. And we see time and time again the rights of immigrants being violated whenever they come into contact with the police, not only here in North Carolina, not only here in Cumberland County or Robeson County, but across this entire nation. And it's not being addressed the way that I want it to be addressed, or that many other individuals across the state want it to be addressed. And I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with some of the individuals in the task force, and this issue of immigration was brought up. And at first, I can say respectfully that it was dismissive. But once I started explaining to them that we have legislation in North Carolina that creates even more tension between those two communities, those should be added in the recommendations. So what are we going to do about ICE in these communities? What are we going to do, or how are individuals in the immigrant community going to be treated once they come in contact with a police officer? None of that is discussed in depth. None of that is discussed in detail. And it's really concerning to me that we are just ignoring a growing, right, community in North Carolina. It's huge. The immigrant community in this state is huge. Not only in the urban centers like Charlotte or the Triangle or Wilmington, but in our rural communities where I am sure not many eyes are there, and there's not a lot of, not a lot of attention being put to some of those cases that may come from those communities. So that is the thing that just really, irks me. And I don't know if Dr. Arriaga, you had anything else on that to add. You don't have to if you don't want to, of course.
I think you summarized a lot of the issues, Manny. I think that I think especially when it comes to immigration policy and immigration enforcement policy, we also have to think about like how many different agencies there are across the state of North Carolina and across the country, which means that like those agencies can have a different policy for each agency. I think where there's like close to 300 and something law enforcement agencies. And so some of the research that I've looked at in the past is thinking about like what does a police officer do if they come in contact with somebody who may be an immigrant, right? Like, what is their policy? What's their protocol? And because we don't have a standard, it just allows for sort of racial profiling, for different ways to sort of handle those situations. And so I do think that obviously this is a federal question, and obviously like legalization and providing people with like legal status is the answer. But because we're not at a place in this country where that's going to happen, or at least, right, I think people have a lot of maybe hope that maybe this year we'll see something happening. But that means that law enforcement agencies across the state are going to be really to have discretion, right? So the ability to do whatever fits into their sort of model, right? And I think for me, for my family, for people we know who are immigrants, that is something that we have to deal with on a regular basis, right? Which is very different than I think the way that particularly Black folks, right, have to think about their interactions with law enforcement, right? So I think there's so many of these instances that we have to think about, but I think immigration is one that we both sort of like don't want some of the data to be tracked because we don't want there to be flags raised about their immigration status. But at the same time, we also want folks to understand that these policies, they really can just be different across each agency. And that's where we want to make sure that like people understand and know how sort of intense this can become when people might be turned over to ICE, right? So I think for us, that's one piece that I think you emphasized, Manny, that we continue to see this. And unfortunately, I think most law enforcement agencies just don't have a good response to this, except for the ones who are really pro, we don't want immigrants, right? Like it's not, we do have a few folks who are sort of more public about, we don't necessarily need to be cooperating with ICE. But even that I think is pretty like limited in the way they're talking about it too. So thank you, Manny, for bringing that up.
Yeah. And and also the intentional nature of those different policies that you were talking about, I have come across law enforcement departments that have been very clear and apparent in making sure that you do not obtain the policy either, right? Because if you actually have the written word, then you would then be able to hold them accountable to what they have actually in writing, but they won't give it to you. And when you ask them, how come I cannot have this? The response typically is, well, it's for safety reasons. And you're like, I can't have a piece of paper that you are guiding an entire department on for safety reasons. So, and so safety is, I don't even know, what that word really means when it's used in that way, right? Because you're telling me that you are a paid government employee and the government policies are supposed to be open to the public, but yet I'm not allowed access to them. for safety reasons. And so, and getting a hold of these things in order for us to really be able to make people accountable is really, you know, one of the hardest pieces of the job around making sure that they're, you know, that they're actually following it, that there's true liberation. And then, because I'm gonna tell you, you know, if it's not for safety reasons, the next response is you're gonna need a court order for that, or you know, or whatever, you know, especially if you don't know what you actually need to obtain these documents. I mean, you could go down any rabbit hole just simply because they don't want you to have it.
Most definitely. And I mean, we can have conversations across the state about what's missing from these recommendations. And I'll respectfully ask the audience to just look at them, see what you think. Ms. Noel, I don't know if you wanted to add something to that.
Just wanted to add, what we're talking about is so much disparity across the state. And so whether we're talking about, you know, enforcement of 287G, or whether we're talking about pursuing the death penalty. I mean, for example, in Durham or Mecklenburg County, you are likely not going to face a capital trial. Now in Durham, that's more explicitly stated than it is in Mecklenburg County. But right next door in Wake County, you probably will face a capital trial. And so, you know, that disparity across our state, I think, Monique, it goes back to what you're saying, that people, our elected officials, are not being held accountable. And that discrepancy and disparity, it always harms those people who are already pushed to the margins.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great segue, Ms. Noel, actually, to the next portion of this conversation, and that is what's taken so long, right? We've talking about these recommendations. We've talking about this task force that they're meeting, they're having their fancy conversations, but people out here, they're still victims of the system that we have. It's not moving fast enough, right? So.
Mm-hmm.
And Ms. Noel, throughout your entire conversation, you touched briefly about what's so difficult, what makes these things so difficult. So I see you come off mute. You want to jump in and say what's taking so long? Why are we seeing these being implemented across our state?
Well, I would defer to someone else to speak specifically to the recommendations, because the ones that I'm most interested in right now really do hinge on legislative action. But I think, you know, disenfranchisement of voter rights is a real issue. Everyone needs to be able to vote, and we all need to vote. And so that's how we're going to address change on a legislative level, and to really acknowledge that everyone's voice is important.
Beautifully said. I love that. And Monique, we've had multiple conversations about what's taking so long for these things to be implemented. You want to share some of that with the audience?
So I believe that what's taking so long is, number one, it's resistance, right? There's resistance to change. There is a resistance to change your mindset. I think that, you know, because I do like to dabble and deal with policy more, I'm in agreement that policy is where we really have to hit it. But also recognizing that the people who are in the General Assembly have to have a mindset to write policy that keeps the cuffs off of people. See, the monster, what I call the criminal justice system, the real monster, once you get thrown into that monster and fall into its belly, it's so difficult to right a wrong, right? So I prefer more progressive and aggressive policy that focuses on keeping the cuffs off of people. If we dealt more with policy that addressed how officers, you know, engage the public, you might see less people in jail, right? But because that's not part of the task force at all, is when it comes to the recommendations, it's dealt with in such a broad way. Even when the public looks at some of these recommendations, I swear if I hear the word training one more time, I'm just gonna scream because that doesn't tell you how to keep the cuffs off of people, right? It doesn't get into any of that. So I think it's resistance. I know intimately that the law enforcement doesn't want to deal with qualified immunity at all. because the focus is on them. And they say that if you're going to deal with qualified immunity, you will not deal with it with just us. They want the judges involved. They want all the officers of the courts involved. They want everybody to be involved, and they don't want it to be isolated to them. And then, of course, you know, the judges are saying, well, you know, I'm making decisions based upon the evidence that's brought to me. Why should I have to go to jail, right? Why should I be held to a high level of scrutiny? And it really is going to have to be everybody. It really, really is. I'm in agreement with the police departments. It shouldn't just be them. I mean, and the reason I say that is because there have been incidences that didn't have to do much with the officer at all. I know that there was a case where there was a judge who was receiving kickbacks, financial kickbacks, let me be very clear, financial kickbacks, because he had an arrangement with the private prison, right? So that might not necessarily be involving the officer, but that judge took it upon himself to put more juveniles in detention centers in order to profit for himself when it came to for-profit prisons. So I just feel like what's really going on is a culture of internal resistance. They don't want to make significant changes, not the ones that I know many of the activist groups are looking for. They don't want to have to do it. I mean, when I started seeing law enforcement officers quit across this nation after the video came out about George Floyd, officers were flat out saying, if I can't do my job the way I've been doing it, I quit, right? I quit. And so that leads to a culture within the entire fraternal order that lets you know, as Felicia was talking about, they may not have the power, but they have the influence, right? This is really a problem for them to have this type of influence over elected officials to the point that they're not even willing to write the bills, because I think that's what we're up against now. We have people who are willing to write the bills that end up putting people in cuffs quickly and more harshly. What we don't have are fighters in that General Assembly who says, I'm going to write an antithesis bill to this that's going to keep the cuffs off of people and to allow more liberation and freedom. That's what we do not have in that General Assembly.
Just given the space right now, does anybody else want to add anything, any thoughts about what's taking so long? Any thoughts about the recommendations or any closing remarks that you may have? Hearing none, I do want to say, I want to go back to what Ms. Noel said. I love that, you know, I do organize in, of course, a democracy in North Carolina. We're all about voting. I'm always talking about the vote. And whenever you look at these amazing recommendations over here, quote unquote, there is, if you look at the far right side of the documents, you will know who is in charge of implementing those policies. For example, recommendation number 5 requires local policy change. Local. You keep on going and you see state policy change and local policy change. It tells you who is responsible to make sure those things are implemented. Well, I know that my legislature is filled with elected officials. I know that my city council are elected officials. I know my DA is an elected official. I know my mayor is an elected official, my county commissioners, so on and so forth. The people responsible to make sure that these things are a success and that they create real positive change in our community are all elected officials. So we really have to pay attention and see what are their thoughts on it. Who's saying what? And if they're not willing to implement these changes, well, let's go out to vote and elect someone that is actually willing to implement these changes. Voting, voting, voting. The general public does have power to create good change in their community. We've done it multiple times throughout this nation. And a lot of times it's deeply rooted through that vote. We have to go out to vote to make sure that we actually get these recommendations implemented in the real world, and that they're not just stuck in a piece of paper somewhere and used as a political tool by your mayor, by your sheriff to say, well, I was interested in this recommendation, and they can talk all they want to, but they don't really want to walk the walk. So that is one thing that I always want to emphasize whenever it comes to the recommendations. If they don't want to do it, we got to find somebody else that does want to do it. But and with that being said, Monique, do you have any closing remarks for us?
So as it relates to the elected officials, I do believe in the power of the vote because it's extremely strong. But I think that, I want all of the voters to start waking up and paying attention to how elected officials operate, right? Because, when you talk to an elected official on your local level and your state level, I'm telling you, you can be sent down a rabbit hole. You can ask a state legislator something, and they'll say, oh, that's something that your local elected officials are supposed to do. You ask a local elected official something, oh, that's for the state to do. I can't do anything about it. We have got to get into our mindsets as voters so that we understand that it's every elected official's responsibility to be on top of all of these matters and work in conjunction with one another. It is not supposed to be a system where you pass the buck as you talk to your constituents. That is something I know that really irritates me, is when people do not want to take personal responsibility about something that's going on in their area. It doesn't matter if you're on the state level and you can't do anything about the local level because you don't vote on that specifically, but you can still get involved. You can get with the local elected officials and say, hey, look, this really is a pressing issue that has to be dealt with on the local level. I want to help you get this done and get more involved in those kinds of things. And so I really think that we have got to start really educating the voter about the fact that we have to stop allowing our elected officials to pass the buck. No more of that. No more. That is not, because it's not working. And then the other thing is I think that everyone who is a voter really needs to start following votes. You need to be looking at the North Carolina General Assembly, clicking on these bills and seeing exactly how people voted on these things. You can take a look at how your city council and your commissioners are voting on things. You've got to take a look at those things, because sometimes who you think is representing you is just a forward-facing persona. It is not actually who they are. And we have got to start seeing people from the way they vote versus what they're telling us. So that's my message as it relates to legislative, because I really believe in the power of the vote. I believe that voters need to be educated. And I think we need to really wake up to who our elected officials are and how they really are voting, so that we know who's really representing us.
So let's take a look. Let's have the last thing be this.
Okay.
These are all the individuals in the task force. Here are their faces, right? Anita Earls, Josh Stein, he's an elected official. We can keep it going and find all the elected officials. Maybe you recognize someone in your community. Mitch Colvin, he's the mayor of Fayetteville, elected official. He's up for re-election next year. Is he gonna walk the walk or just talk the talk, right?
We'll see.
We'll see. Durham Police Department Chief of Police, and just so you know, police chiefs are appointed by their mayor. So voting for the mayor is very important. Oh God, I think I just messed all that up.
It's okay.
So we keep going. I see representatives at the General Assembly. I see county commissioners. I see sheriffs, more representatives, right? So it's filled with a lot of individuals that could utilize this task force as a political tool for re-election. Let's not let them do that. If they actually do want change, they got to go back to their communities and actually do the work to make sure that they are implemented. And Sarah, I see you came off mute. You wanna add something to this?
Yeah, I just would like to add that hearings are happening right now statewide on public hearings on redistricting, a process which is underway right now. We have 100 counties, and these are only happening in a handful of counties statewide. But in the past, we know that our legislators have drawn our maps in ways that are unfair and in ways that benefit them. And they've been able to choose their voters instead of the opposite. So I just, for the audience, I want to make a plug to attend a meeting if you feel comfortable and if you're able. I believe they're in person. There are opportunities to submit comments on the General Assembly's website and to sign up to speak. And Southern Coalition for Social Justice right now is doing trainings on how to speak at these hearings. And they also are, they're publishing a list of the hearings when they are, but these hearings right now and the maps that end up coming about as a result are going to impact who our lawmakers are. And we know that the process has been struck down in the past. So it's so I would really encourage people to pay attention right now to the process and get involved if you can.
Yeah, there's an upcoming meeting on September the 15th to speak at on redistricting at the Durham Technical Community College. It'll happen Wednesday at 6 p.m. September 15th. So if anyone wants to speak on redistricting, that's the closest one that I know from the Wake County area. Not sure about any other areas. I'm sorry, that's Durham County, Durham County.
Thank you, Monique, and thank you, Sarah, for plugging that in, man. With that, everyone, thank you all so much for joining us today in this very important conversation. Thank you all so much. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to us and we'll get those questions answered to you. As a reminder, please get involved, go out to vote, and continue fighting for your community because change is possible. Thank you all so much.
All right, have a lovely night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.